Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. Well, it is a whole new world since the pandemic, a whole new work world, that is. Who would have thought that many people would be working on a hybrid model or completely remotely, never setting foot inside their workplace, and even working from different parts of the world? But whether you work from home or you're still going into work every day, how do you ensure that your time is spent in the most productive and satisfying way, especially when we feel demands made on us can be overwhelming and our relationship with technology, that's intensifying, and there are just too many distractions around us? Well, let's help clear some of that noise and talk about what actually works with Dr. Brynn Winegard. She's an applied neuroscientist who focuses on brain health and how we work best. She's the author of a new book called The Working Brain, Optimize Your Workday Performance, and she joins us. Brynn, it's so nice to see you again.
So nice to see you, Mary. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your book. So I read it. It is loaded. Loaded with so much science, evidence, studies on the brain and how we work. It's impossible to get through every aspect of the book, but I just want to hit some of the key areas. The first thing that surprised me, which I actually hadn't heard before, was that our brain has its own rhythm outside of the rhythms of our body. And you mentioned, circadian rhythms. Many of us are familiar with that, but can you talk about the rhythm of our brain?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that the body works on the circadian rhythm, which is that day, night, dark, light, sleep, wake cycle. And for the longest time, we understood that all organs worked on that all the, of course the brain would. And actually the brain works on a much shorter cycle called the ultradian rhythm or the ultradian cycle. Now, ultradian just means shorter than a day in Latin. Through your waking hours, your cycle is about 90 minutes of uptime, we think, with about 20 minutes of what we consider to be an ultradian healing response, it's called, or a refractory period for the physicians, the physics folks in the room. The idea that refractory period would be able to shrink would allow us more uptime. However, what they've shown is that actually the advent, and you mentioned this in your intro, the advent and use of technology has in fact shortened this cycle. So instead of 90 minutes of uptime followed by about 20 minutes of downtime, we're seeing that downtime, the healing response, still 20 minutes, but that actually uptime is much shorter than 90 minutes. Some researchers posit that it's about half that. And if you can think that, so 45 minutes of working uptime, of working available cognitive productivity. And some people think it's even, somewhere in that 45 to 60 range, which if you think now intuitively about your workday and the times that you've had to be really highly productive, actually, it's true, you don't have just these swaths of time that are just completely productive for 90, 120, 300 minutes in a row. You don't. You go through this ebb and flow. And so sometimes we call it the BRAC, the basic rest and activity cycle. But that BRAC for the brain is called the ultradian rhythm. And yeah, it's somewhere from 45 to 90 minutes of uptime and no shorter in the downtime. The downtime has remained about 20 minutes or so.
I think that would be shocking to a lot of people. I don't think it's shocking that we have a rhythm and we know that we work better in certain periods and then, we're tired, our brain needs a bit of a rest. But 45 minutes to an hour and a half, that's not very long. So it seems to me as if the way the typical workday is structured, to work for 8 hours a day, you have a little break in the morning, maybe 15 minutes, whatever, an hour for lunch, then another little break in the afternoon. That doesn't cut it, according to the brain science.
Yeah. Yes, it certainly doesn't. And really not in our younger generations who are now coming into the workforce in, higher numbers and who are taking over. What we're seeing is they're not only working attention spans are lower, of course, because they were born with internet, with technology. They're very highly technologically connected and dependent, like they use tech for everything. And so those I want to call them kids, but those workers we are finding have much shorter working uptime through that ultradian rhythm. And they do need just as much downtime as anyone else. And you're right, it would surprise people twofold. I think one is to find out that you do need a lot more breaks. Like 15 minutes is not enough. In fact, that hour at lunch is probably ultimately too long because what happens is you miss a series of cycles. You're into another cycle by the time the hour is up. And so you're sort of off sync, which is another reason why when people go back to their desk right around 1 o'clock or force themselves back into working, they're somewhere not in sync with their
You're
own kind
right.
of working rhythm. So I would suggest that lunch actually be shorter. It's something closer to about 45 minutes, and then you get back at it. But there's no question either, and this is on that circadian ultimate rhythm. There's no question that the afternoon is a dead zone for productivity and cognitive performance. And then what we see also is that, so 45 minutes, you've got less time than you think you do. The other piece of this is that when we look at the overall cycles, the likelihood that you have through the working day, 9 to 5, the likelihood that you have any your real major cognitive peaks is very low. Most of us are somewhere in that 7:30 to 8 o'clock in the morning. And then again, 7:30 at 8 o'clock at night, we have this second wind called a semicircadian cycle or semicircadian moment. And then what we see is that actually the likelihood that you have had your most cognitive performance throughout the day at work is very low, but the likelihood that you've had your daily low in the afternoon is very high. So actually, people would also be surprised, I think, to find out not only is your working attention span, your ability to perform much shorter than you thought it was, shorter in younger generations, but actually overall, it's probably not even happening during that 9 to 5.
Yeah, that is okay. That's amazing. So given that we have this ebb and flow, and I actually like the way you put it in the book, you said that the workday is not a marathon. It's more like sprints, these short sprints you're taking, right? And that makes sense, again, based on that 45, to 60 or maybe 90-minute window. So then knowing this, how do we best approach our workday?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great question. I think one of the key insights is that you would start earlier. So especially if you're in knowledge work, as you are, as I am, most of us in knowledge work these days, what you would do is you would start earlier. So you'd expect that your actual most productive time is earlier in the day. And so think 7:30, 8 o'clock, probably by 8 o'clock, you want to be doing your heaviest lifting. The other piece of that is that you would organize your day such that the first things in your day are not meeting with other people. They're not spent on the treadmill. They're not spent answering emails. That's the temptation, right? You want to answer all your emails. You want to go through each thing. Actually, that's your cognitive best of the day. And so what you want to do is put that off until, and I call them the 4 M's, but the idea that meetings and administration and, email, that stuff you want to do in the afternoon when you're otherwise feeling like you're lagging. And so if your day starts earlier, your day also starts preferably alone. And by that, I don't mean that, I love the idea of collaboration in office. The return to office is important, but not in the morning. In the morning is when you have your best brain, your freshest brain. All that great neurochemistry has reset from a night of sleep. We hope a really restful, good one. But the idea that if you're starting earlier, then you are going to get more out of yourself. You'll get your stuff done that you have as high priority. And then you can move into the rest of your day offering yourself to other people through email and messaging, through meetings, through interactions. But if you don't have your stuff finished, then the rest of your day is not going to get much better, right? Because we're not looking at a brain that's going to be any fresher.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know what? That sounds so foreign to me personally. And I'm wondering, okay, there must be other people like me because I find I don't like mornings. I think I function best like actually right at night and into the late night. I feel like I get creative and I'm thinking all kinds of wild and crazy thoughts, like in a good way. And so like, is that for everybody?
Well, so you are a nighthawk. So you have a different, everyone has different orientations. We think there's about 3. It also changes incidentally over the life course. So as you age, you are more likely to find that you are awake at 2 a.m. and completely needing a nap at 2 p.m., right? Like the idea that these things, they do naturally change. We sometimes have called that the grandmother effect, but it's the idea that historically in tribal species, we would need sentinels at night while the rest of us were sleeping uninterrupted. And so actually we find that it's very functional as a tribe that some people would be awake at different hours and have these different preferences for when it is that they find they're their best self. I'm going to put it to you like this. Whenever your natural waking hours are, about 45 minutes later is when you are at your cognitive peak because there's the sleep inertia of having just woken up. Okay, so I'm still a little bit groggy, and that might not be 7:30 in the morning. For that might be 10 a.m. for you. But the idea that you're still a little bit groggy for a while. But once those cobwebs have cleared, maybe you've had a coffee, you've hydrated a little bit more, sleep inertia has worn off. you're fully conscious and aware of the day, that's probably your best cognitive performance for the day. And so to give it away is to, the premise of the first couple chapters anyway, to give it away is to undermine the rest of your day. So whenever that timing is for you, sort of 45 to an hour, after you've woken up, is your cognitive prime. And so that's when you want to do your cognitive heaviest lifting, the things that are highest priority, that are the hardest. Sometimes you've heard that adage, eat your frogs for breakfast, do the toughest thing first. That's because your brain is the freshest. And it doesn't matter if you're a night hawk, you've still had whatever number of hours of sleep has reset your brain. The toxins have been cleared. Your brain has been cleansed. Your neurochemistry has reset itself. Lots of things happen. You're actually neurally rewired throughout the night, right? When you're doing your REM sleeping. So you're actually a ton better off right after, that sleep, whenever that is.
That is so fascinating. Okay. So let me ask you this. Within that, period of productivity, that 45 minutes or whatever, right? You also, you segment it and you say that, at the beginning of it, there's a climb, right? To the peak. Can you talk about that and why that can be difficult? Because I think about it myself. And if I have something really difficult to do, and I do need to do it, let's say, soon after I wake up, first thing in the morning, I just find it, oh my goodness, this is so daunting. This is so difficult. And I'll stall and I'll delay it and I won't want to do it. And is that typical though of that kind of, sort of entry into that climb period?
Yes, especially your first one. If it is something, as an example, that you have been, that is very difficult, that you've been ruminating against, there's a lot of tricks in the book. So there is, to your first point, the ultradian cycle. I renamed some of that BRAC, like the basic rest activity cycle, to the climb, the peak, the fall, and the valley. Both the climb and the fall are periods of flux that are challenging for different reasons. And they're not just challenging cognitively, they're challenging mentally. So this is when you're mentally, like psychologically, emotionally, this is when those emotions might enter into it. You get frustrated, you get irritated through the climb and the fall. This is when, you start to perhaps even self-handicap, but you start to notice you're procrastinating. And a lot of that, I sometimes say, when asked, a lot of that is very functional because it could well be your subconscious, some of your systems, your default mode networks telling you that, you don't have all the resources for this yet. You don't have enough fluid. You don't have enough hydration. You don't have enough information. You don't have enough resources. And so, one of the culminating pieces in the book is the idea that you get really attuned to listening to yourself and to listening to, your brain only has a few ways to communicate with you. And there's oftentimes when you're finding that those attentional resources are really hard to command and control. Inhibition, distractions, detractors are really starting to create a problem for you. You are having those emotions start to creep in, the negative ones, the negative self-talk even, the ones that are getting really irritated and frustrated, you're starting to feel that activity. That can also all be very functional in the sense that it's your system telling you, this is not the right time to do this.
Right.
No, not always. We don't want to quit from the turn.
Okay. So let me ask you then. So, I mean, if let's say you are having difficulties getting to the job during that so-called climb period, can you tell me about some tricks that we can use, right, to get over that hump?
Yeah. Well, there's tons, of course.
Yeah.
I sometimes, we often talk about the 15-minute rule. Like, just give yourself 15 minutes. That's how long it's going to take, by the way, to get through the climb. And most people, and this was, there's great research that shows this in the physiology, diet, and lifestyle research, sports medicine stuff, that basically when you have somebody who's post-op or somebody who's, been very sedentary in their lives, and you ask them, well, can you do 15 minutes of walking? Can you do 15 minutes of a jogging? They think cognitively, we think typically that 15 minutes is actually very manageable psychologically. So they think, well, yeah, I can commit to 15 minutes. And so 15 minutes of anything that's hard actually gets you through the climb. So it's like we're tricking you into just committing to 15 minutes. And then, of course, the 15-minute rule, or the 15-minute idea, is that at the end of 15 minutes, you get to quit if you want to. You can stop. But of course, now neurocognitively, all your systems are aligned toward the peak. And so you've started to create momentum in whatever project, initiative, task you're working on. And that has allowed people will continue on, because something called the Zeigarnik effect shows us that actually it's very irritating to the human mind is to quit something, because it's unfinished. It's like unfinished business. And so people don't want to do that. They actually want that inertia, that momentum is something that allows them to maintain their productivity over time. And so what we see is if you can kind of trick yourself into doing it, then you will have that inertia and momentum through that ultradian cycle, which will carry you the rest of the way.
Right.
You've now created.
I love that. I love that 15-minute trick. Is it even more effective? I'm sure there have been studies done on this. If you put a timer on it.
Yes, of course. I mean, the Pomodoro effect is another one, right?
I love that Pomodoro effect.
Yes, not discovered by a gentleman named Pomodoro, I might add. But anyway, the Pomodoro is a different one. It does not follow the ultradian rhythm, so that's not exact. It's 25 minutes, 5 minutes off. But the idea that actually what it is doing is allowing you these manageable, micro-sized, what I sometimes call chewable chunks, another trick in the book, these micro moments of doing something for just a little while with the promise of a break afterward, and not a long break, not a full 15, 20 minutes, which is the ultradian rhythm, but actually something closer to 5. But it just gives you that staccato, like you mentioned earlier, that series of, instead of thinking of your day like a marathon, you think of it like a series of little sprints. And that's just much more psychologically manageable, which is the trick behind the chewable chunks thing, right? You take whatever it is you're working on, you break it up into the smallest pieces that you think you can handle, and that helps you just tackle it.
Okay, so let's just say we get through that tough period. When we talk about hitting that peak, right? When we're at our best, how do we take advantage of that peak period?
You can hold yourself in peak performance longer when you're not doing super easy things that are boring. If you find yourself bored, you will more quickly go into the fall, into that ultradian stress response, because the brain is just not stimulated enough. You're just not trying hard enough. So actually a modicum of challenge is really important. And I talk about this in the book too, but we are very highly motivated to produce and to achieve and to toil, frankly. Like we're built for work. Work preferably we enjoy, of course, not the stuff we're being told to do we don't enjoy. But to be productive and to achieve and to accomplish is a self-fulfilling, tautological, really healthy space neurochemically and neurocognitively. And so what you want to do at that peak is be working on something that you find moderately and reasonably challenging. It'll hold you in peak longer, because that's when the body and the brain work together to say, this is great. Like this is hard and it's worthwhile and I'm loving it, but I'm neurochemically getting really activated here. If you're bored, if you're distracted, if the environment is bad, if you're thirsty, you're hungry, you're upset, none of these things, of course, will be the case, right? That's not an environment where you're going to reach your cognitive optimization.
Yeah. I mean, easier said than done, right? Because so many of us are in jobs where we have to do what we have to do. And it may not have that perfect, that right amount of challenge that, we crave. It may just be kind of every day.
Yeah.
It's difficult to find, just the right kind of measure of challenge.
Absolutely it is. I think part of all of this is to get you thinking about, like all my research, the book, the impetus behind the book even is to get people thinking about themselves a little more reflexively and a little bit more in tune with what their systems are telling them, with what and how it feels. To know, as an example, this is a moment where this challenge is not high enough for me, or this is way too challenging. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm going to go into a place where I'm not capable of producing at all. So both ends of the spectrum are bad. And so we're looking for kind of that medium amount of kind of stress and challenge and difficulty that's going to produce the best results. Not too little, not too much. And to know oneself and to know when and how that feels is half the battle. But only you can know what's going to put you there. So only you can know what feels like an adequate amount of challenge, not too much, not too little. Only you can know what feels like an adequate amount of stress, not too much, not too little. And the idea that then you're much more capable of managing your environment, and if not your environment, your expectations. Because expectations are very create a negative mental space. So psychologically, they're very challenging. We call them expectation violations or expectancy violations. But they're the idea that I expected one thing, I got a different thing. And that's usually frustrating. It's usually irritating and disappointing. And so when you manage your own expectations, you also find that then you are much less prone to feeling like, I'm just, drudging through this. And you say, this is a moment of drudgery. I was expecting drudgery today. Here it is, so.
This makes me also think about what you mentioned earlier, right? About distractions and that, we can be distracted by so many things during our workday. And I'm wondering, because so many of our lives have become more sedentary because of technology, right? I mean, for me too, I sit in front of a screen most of the day. Um, does that cause us to be more easily distracted because we operate on these ultradian rhythms and we need a break, but we don't take those breaks. And so we just get distracted because we
Yes.
want to.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Well, and Dr. Susan Greenfield, she's in the UK, also a researcher, proved basically that exact effect. That the more tech we use, the more distractible we are, the less working attention spans we have, the less capable we are of inhibiting distractions, and the less capable we are of actually focusing and concentrating on things. And so to your point, not only, and that's the blue light, but it's also the fact that technology is, a strange, the brain tech interaction is a strange and foreign one, because you have to remember the brain is many millions of years in the making and tech is relatively new. So your brain is constantly having to compensate for that interaction between the two things. And of course, that blue light is sort of a false thing to be looking at all the time. It's a different reality. You're drawing very heavily to in tech use, in interaction, on conceptual environments, on virtual conceptualizations of things. So very heavily on like your imagination and your, how it is that you conceive of things in your mind's eye. Your brain gets tired of that. And so then as soon as you start to fatigue, then what you do see is the inhibition of distractions gets lowered. Your threshold gets higher. And so what you start to see is that, you get much more distracted. It's much harder to focus, much harder to stay concentrating on something. Because your brain is just sort of tired and that interaction is an exhausting one. Yeah.
So then let's just say, you need a break. And rather than turning to a distraction that's not helpful, if you're in that resting healing period, right, which you said is about 20 minutes, what is the optimum way to use that time?
Ooh, it's such a great question. I think my favorite is to try to avoid tech. I know so many people take the break, they take their mobile device and start to scroll, endlessly.
TikTok.
Yes, well, it's tempting. It's addictive. It's meant to be. We understand addiction when it comes to substances. We're still in our infancy of truly understanding addiction when it comes to these, social media and other medias that are definitely afflicting our younger generations more than probably yourself and me, Mary, but not to date us, but the idea that
it's okay. I've been around.
We know a world when there was no such thing. And of course, these younger generations don't. But, I love if you can avoid tech during that time. I love if you can get outside and breathe some fresh air. I mean, of course, in the book, there's 20 some odd things. But the idea is I love if you can actually interact with someone else. So talk to somebody socially. Your brain loves social interaction. One of our major campaigns now is to talk about the return to the office, even if it's just hybrid some days a week, is fantastic for you. It's great for your brain. It's how your brain understands social support physically. And so that and social support and lack of social isolation is really important for how all of your systems work neurocognitively and mentally and psychologically. And then the idea that, you're talking to somebody, you might be outside. My favorite thing to advise or to advocate, it's not formal exercise in the sense of like go and pump some iron. No. What I love though is if you can move on those 20 minutes. The other thing about that is a lot of people say, well, if I'm going to go move, I might take half an hour or go for a run. Actually, those breaks need to be limited to no more than 20 minutes, but no less than 15, because all the research shows that you've not done the full ultradian healing response in less than 15 minutes. It's just not possible to reset all those synaptic clefts and all that neurochemistry has to be literally manufactured. But to take longer than 20 is to also create a circumstance where in that refractory period, you've lost the plot. So it's just harder to get back to the task at hand. So sometime between 15 and 20 minutes, and I'd love if you could physically idly move. And there's a reason for that. Like do laundry, walk a dog, just don't just sit there is all. Walk around the office, go for a walk, preferably outside in a garden with greenery. We call that green exercise, great for you. Interact with somebody else. You can drag a friend along, do it. But the reason is because a lot of those default mode networks, those restorative networks of the brain that do pro forma analyses for you and decide whether or not the world is, things are, the momentum of the day and of your circumstance, of your context is good versus bad. A lot of those systems, they work best when you're physically moving, but not exerting yourself extremely. But it's the idea that you just do kind of little non-exercise based movements. that then really do add up over time, firstly, in terms of your steps and your calories and so on. But it also helps those parts of your brain that then get to come online, that are the parts of the brain that are highly restorative. So like default mode networks and other networks that are analogous and similar. And they're the ones that then allow you to mind wander or daydream or have
yeah.
eureka moments. Yeah.
I love what you said. I love what you said in the book about daydreaming, because I think most people think, well, daydreaming, that just seems so counterproductive, right? That's not productive to our day.
Yes. Yeah. You would think that, and that's the thing, to look at somebody daydreaming is to think you're looking at a total slacker, but actually not. What's happening in their mind, if they really are daydreaming, what's happening is it's exactly as it sounds. It's like a little dream. And nighttime dreaming, which happens during the REM cycle of your sleep, nighttime dreaming is when all neural networks get rejigged and learning is consolidated and knowledge becomes actual memories, or new things learned, new stimuli become memories. And so I often joke that like knowledge is just the memory of having learned something. And those learning knowledge memory networks, they're all highly integrated. They all consolidate during nighttime sleep. But during daytime daydreaming, this is when we see like micro versions of that. So little synaptic clefts that get together and little neural networks that slightly reorganize or reinterpret things. So as to be able, this is often when people report having most of their eureka moments. This is when they're most creative. They suddenly, something they've been working on, a solution, suddenly like an apparition becomes obvious to them.
And are you a fan of power napping? Do you think that works?
It's such a good question. The research is out on it. I'm not personally. The research is out on it for a lot of reasons, because it's always researched in different contexts and so on. I'll tell you why I'm not a huge fan. One is because a lot of people are using it as a substitute for nighttime sleep. So what happens is they've either lost sleep the night before, or they think, I have time for a nap, I'm going to take it. But then what happens is they compromise their night of sleep to come. And we know that actually those 7 to 9 hours that you need, and probably more for women, great new research showing that your adrenal axis takes more time to create those hormonal reserves. So you probably, women of, anywhere from sort of 18 to 65, need something closer to 10 hours a night.
Oh my goodness. Tell my husband that.
Yes, I know.
Tell him.
But men don't need as much.
I'm going to tell him that.
Yeah. They need something close to probably 7.5. They just don't have as much adrenal activity on a typical basis. And that's not where their hormones are being manufactured and looping through. And so what happens is that actually napping is a challenge for folks who are substituting their nighttime nap, or it's sometimes also a couple of things, so it decreases what we call sleep drive for the night to come. It sometimes also, the nap itself creates sleep inertia. And so in that ultradian cycling, you're compromised. If you go on and on too long, then it doesn't help you, right? Because you've now compromised a lot of productive uptime throughout the day. And so a power nap, maybe, but I say, limit it to kind of like 20 minutes, get the environment right. In one of the chapters, I talk about rest, which is just, pseudonym for sleep, and downtime and stuff. But the idea that if you don't have the environment right for that, you're not going to get the requisite amount of rest that you need. What some people notice, and more women than men, is that because during actual sleep, so even if you're napping, your brain gets cleansed through the cerebral spinal fluid, through the meninges, you're getting like a cleansing that happens. And so actually there's this expansion and contraction. And when that happens and you wake up in the middle of it, you wake up feeling not just cognitively out of it, like, oof, kind of woozy, groggy, or unable to refocus and find your attentional resources. You also feel kind of nauseated. And on purpose, right? It's supposed to slow you down so that system can do the rest of its work. So that again is counterproductive. Like that's not going to help you throughout the day. The other thing about that is that, maybe some Silicon Valley companies, and certainly if you're working from home, you have the opportunity to nap, but it's also optically not ideal, which I don't talk about until chapter 10 or so, Interact. But it's the idea that you're also managing how people perceive you. And so daydreaming, mind wandering in moderation every now and then, that's fine. But, as you don't want to do it, I don't think anyway, too obviously, right? Because it doesn't look like a productive person. Yeah.
I would hope people would know that.
Yeah. You would be surprised.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to cover here. I want to get though to two areas. I mean, well, first of all, I should say, like you've mentioned a lot of what you call this framework called merit, right?
Yeah,
which is very helpful because So we've talked about move a little bit, not much about eating. And then there's the rest aspect, which you talked about. But the last two particularly interest me. Yeah, because I've talked a lot about the first three on this podcast, but the last two being to interact and to think. So I want to talk about interact because that seems to come up more and more. And I'm going to bring in the fact now that, yes, so we're in this post-pandemic world. Many of us have this hybrid model or we're completely virtual. I know a number of people who are, in fact, not just virtual. One couple I know decided to just rent a camper and they worked from their camper virtual. Like it was like they lived in a whole other world while they were working. Do you know what I mean? Which is, remote. Remote. I mean, that's kind of cool in its own way, but you seem to be favoring the old fashioned, well, you need to be with everybody at the workplace. You seem to be saying that's really what's best for us. Are you? Is that what you're saying?
There is so much great research that shows, that the human brain works best with others. And I did a whole dissertation on where knowledge comes from. How do you know new things?
Yes.
You know new things from other people.
It's so true. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the human brain doesn't understand social support that isn't physically manifested. And so when we don't have social support or we feel socially isolated, that is a very risky place for you psychologically and chemically, neurochemically. And so we see that is a prerequisite is often the etiology of a lot of psychiatric disorders. So you really do want social support and you really want to feel a sense of community. And what I often say is belongingness, embeddedness, connectedness. That cannot happen in the human tech connection. Like you need that physically. And so it needs to be physically, again, this is just because our brains are old and, tech is new. And so because of that, you need a sense of community. You need a sense of interaction, a sense of connectedness. That just needs to happen in person. There's we could really get technical on it. Your mirror neuron system, that's how it works. It's highly connected to your emotional system.
So sorry, you're saying Zoom doesn't do it. You could be on Zoom with a whole bunch of people all day long, but that's not going to cut.
You may objectively know these are people that have your back, that like you, that work with you, that are supportive of you, that are collaborative with you. But at the physiological level and at the neurocognitive level, through the retinas of your mind that come to your mirror neuron system, it did not compute that you were not alone. You were physically alone. Part of the reason for that is because we take information about our social environment and about our level of social support, not just from ocular cues. We take the pheromones in the air. All five senses are part of our olfaction and part of our sensory inputs that help us understand our social circumstances. And so to be in the same room alone looking at a camera, I often joke that the camera is like the black abyss of the camera. It's thankless. It gives you nothing back. So you can, pretend that you even conceptually know I'm supported, I'm working with collaborative folk, but you didn't actually give your body any of the physiological cues for that. And the brain knows it. And so it will compensate. And so you will still find that you're delving into chronic loneliness. Now, maybe not your couple that's remote, in the sense they at least have each other and they're getting a lot of other really good things like greenery and fresh air and exercise and activity. We love that. I mean, those are all really advantageous things. But I do love, and it's all predicated on the research, not an opinion, that you would have some days of the week, especially in your work environment, where we often say, where you work, how you glean not only parts of your identity, but also all the resources for your life and your family. That is a very important place to feel connected and supported, because if you start feeling isolated there, you do start to feel threatened about your very ability to exist and to provide and to, flourish and so on. And so there's no possibility of that if you don't feel your social support. And so in order to feel that social support, you got to meet people in person. That's just how the mirror neuron systems work.
Yeah.
How the five senses work.
So listen, I know a lot of people who are doing a 3-day work week. So there are 3 days at the office and then 2 days at home. Does that cut it, or that's still not good enough?
Right. Yeah. It's great. I mean, anything's better than nothing. So I'm going to just, even 1 day a week, I'll take it. And it doesn't have to be even in a formal office necessarily. Like, it's just the idea that you're getting together in person physically. Okay. I do understand, like, lots of people are remote, but they will get together for coffee or for one-on-ones. Also very functional. I mean, just any amount of that is great. And we also have shown, that as you get together with people. You learn new things. You can conceptualize different perspectives. Your democracy of thought goes up. Your level of innovation, creativity goes up. How happy you are. A lot of those, oxytocin is a neurochemical that really only can be activated through interactions with others. It's very helpful for sensations of sort of like emotional euphoria and a sense of connectedness, and a sense of belongingness. So, I mean, you can't even get it if you're only interacting with technology.
Right.
So yeah, any is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I don't know what the studies have shown regarding productivity, with employees who are remote compared to productivity if they're in the office. Is there a clear answer to that yet or
Oh,
not?
no, I know there
No.
is no
Okay.
clear answer.
No.
Everyone's different. So,
Mm.
and that's partly because how their loneliness has set in and how their systems started, everyone was at variable levels. But just imagine that over time, eventually isolation will compromise both their mental and cognitive functioning.
The reason why I asked you about whether there is evidence to show that perhaps one mode of work is better than the other is because I think, and it depends again on the companies, but when I look at it from the employer's point of view, if they have found that people working completely virtually or even on a hybrid model are just as productive, right? So it's the bottom line. The bottom line is being met. They're producing. It's cheaper for them that they're working from home. That's really a hard sell, isn't it, then, to bring them back into the office, even though the evidence points to the employees, it's better for them and
Yeah,
ultimately better for the work. And even if it's
yeah.
ultimately better for the workplace, right? Like it's a difficult sell for some employers.
Yeah, well, and some employers have found the opposite. That what happened was because, like the placebo effect, like the Pygmalion effect, you probably read about if you ever did Psych 101. Change is actually difficult, but what it creates is an uptick in productivity and performance because suddenly you're paying attention to what you're doing. It is true, though, that at most companies, including Amazon and a lot of the ones that are calling folks back to work, they found that there was an uptick in productivity when people were sort of not maybe in the full first of quarantine in the pandemic, but sort of in those medium year, like that first year, productivity actually increased because people were able to work whenever. Now, burnout also increased because if you work from home, you never leave the office.
Yeah.
And so what happened is that people were not productive. They didn't sustain that heightened level of productivity. And then chronic loneliness did set in. And so what we are seeing now is supreme dips, not in every category, not in every person, not in every company, but we are seeing in general supreme dips in productivity overall. And that's why companies are calling people back into the office because what was a lift in the productivity and performance of some employees is now we're starting to see lag there. And Gallup, I think, they just released their 2024. Here's what we're finding. And basically productivity is low and negative emotions are soaring and psychiatric, issues and psychological problems are now, we have an epidemic of that, mental health problems. So, and they write, it's a 500-page, you can read it, it's great. But, because it's written also in layperson speak, right? To be able to understand.
Oh, good. My bedtime reading. Fine.
Oh,
500 pages. I won't be working.
What a joy. Yeah. No, it is actually. I really enjoy their report. It's very detailed. And there's many that are analogous to that show same, that we did see lift because we saw people just kind of, once they weren't afraid of dying, they were a little bit more capable of doing a lot of things and they were more productive and they enjoyed their life and they could wear pajamas. But then the chronic loneliness set in, and now we're starting to see that no, people are not productive anymore. So companies will incur those fees again, because it's also very hard, as you can imagine, from an employer perspective. It's hard to manage people who are not physically visible. And so management also suffered of individual contributors. Individual contributors have started to feel a lot more loneliness. And so, there's benefit for both employer and employee in some days of the week being present physically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about this last area now of merit, which is the thinking part. I'm fascinated by that. And okay, I'm going to take a guess here. Just because I feel like that the mental health aspect of this, I think sometimes or often gets overlooked. And it's just so important. And I'm wondering, you tell me, even if you were to do the other four, right? The move, the eat, the rest and the interact. And you tried your best at those other four.
Yeah.
if you have a bad mental health state, so, you talked about all those negative emotions and maybe there's a loop running through your brain and all that.
Mhm.
I'm guessing that alone could overpower the benefits of the other four.
That's right. You're so
Oh,
right.
okay.
Yeah. And I think it's written there in sort of different, in different,
Yeah.
they're not mutually exhaustive. Like how you eat affects how you
Sure.
think, how you think
Yeah.
affects how you sleep. But to your point, mindset, that inner mental world that you create and allow to pervade through your days is present all the time. And so it affects everything else. It affects how motivated you are to exercise. It affects what you choose to eat, right? You want more salt, fat, sugar when you feel more stressed. And so everything is affected by how your mental state and how you're thinking. And so one of the calls to action in the Think in that final of the Merit framework, they were predicated on my latest research in lifestyle and mind body medicine. But the idea that in mind body and lifestyle medicine, there are 6 pillars, some of which include stress management and avoiding, toxic substances like drugs and alcohol. And I put that into eat. And then I put stress management kind of throughout. But then I included these other 2 pillars that are not true of lifestyle medicine, of that interact and think. And it's because everything your mental state does, to your point, you said it, I'm just reiterating, it affects everything else you do. It affects every other choice you make. And those are all choices, whether you think so or not. And then that mindset piece, one of the calls to action is to really monitor your inner world. Your inner world is one, this is so funny because I had a gentleman come up to me not very long ago. I wrote an article about it. He said, I thought that the definition of free will was just being able to either accept or deny the thoughts that come into your mind, which is a very externalizing way to understand that all those thoughts are your own. They're not coming from some divine source.
That's
They're
right.
you. And you primed those networks to have that thought. And there's no blame or fault here. It's just about the idea that you can not only deny them, but recreate neural circumstances that do not allow for negative thinking and for the biases that go into a lot of this. And so your inner world, this is in the intro, we talk about Marvel masterpiece, misfit. Your brain is your own masterpiece. You can create those neural networks. And what those neural networks, especially in those idle moments when those default mode networks will tell you things, you'll hear a little, those are all you, like those are all neural circuitry that you've primed to have those thoughts. And free will is certainly more than just accepting or denying them. And you can prime them differently and you can build them differently. And that all comes into how you feed that inner world. And that is the onus is on you then to own that inner space and to accept that it, is your responsibility and that you can create a healthier one. You can create a healthier, happier headspace. You can challenge your internal narratives. You do not need to just live with what's happening in your mind. And so that's part of the first piece of it is that, your inner world is yours to create, and it is based on your neural circuitry. It is based on all the other things you've done. Do you have the right hydration levels? Do you have the right, nutrition, all of that? Have you slept enough? Of course, you're going to have negative emotions when you're sleep deprived. But that mindset piece is important because it pervades everything else you do.
Yeah. I love that story you just said about the man.
Yeah.
About information, because you're absolutely right. Everything we get, someone tells us, but we decide how we receive that information.
Yep. And a lot of that is being decided, in fact, in our non-conscious when we're sleeping. And so a lot of people ask me, like, what do dreams mean? Dreams are sort of like, the best way to think of them is like a movie while your neural networks are deciding whether it's taking the information that it received throughout the day and actually embedding that into neural networks, or is it going to discard that information? And so oftentimes, that's why dreams are not premonitions. They are pattern recognition sometimes, so sort of premonition-ish, but they're not premonitions. They're not from the external world. They don't mean anything.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I had a dream. I had another neuroscientist, dream expert, said exactly the same thing. People always try to impose all these meanings on dreams. They really don't mean anything.
No, what you will find is that above average, your dreams will sometimes happen or materialize in the real world in small ways or in partial ways, or resemble a circumstance. But that's because your brain is a master pattern recognizer. And so what it is also doing, especially in your lucid dreams, so when you can, the ones you remember, it's giving you patterns back of your life to say, hey, by the way, watch out for this. Or, hey, by the way, expect this, expectancy violations. It's trying to protect you. It's trying to build a model of your world that's realistic so that you can do the right things and make the right actions, make the right decisions. And so that's the other thing, is that, to your point, a lot of what's happening is random, and your brain decides during sleep, in fact, whether or not it's going to take what it's learned or what it's been subjected to and implement that somewhere into real like hardwired neural circuitry, or is it going to just throw it out and discard it? It's immaterial.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. We've just scratched the surface on this today, but this, it's just amazing work that's going on in neuroscience and all the research that you've put into this book. I have to, I'm going to end off with two quick things. Yeah. First of all, do you follow all this?
Yes.
You do? Okay. So is it just like second nature to you?
It is to some extent. Yeah. It's such a good insight. I just am sort of like fundamentally interested in it. So I'm picking up little pieces all the way along everywhere I can.
Yeah.
And always comparing, kind of critically evaluating, like, what have I heard before? How does that compare to what's now? So I can always tell you what's new, like, where is the science advanced to? Because I know how it contradicts what we've learned or what we knew historically, what was common knowledge before. So yeah, I do. I follow it. I love it. Now, you probably heard this before too, because you interview so many academics and academicians, but we often say that like research is me-search. And it's the idea that, if it's self-relevant, of course it's going to be of interest, right? And then you have just infinite kind of ability to store this information. So I do find it's of personal interest. So then, of course, it became a professional interest.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, there's so much takeaway here, but if there's one thing, because you have many, many clients, you talk to many people, there must be a pattern there as well of, something that really is gripping to people and that you want them to think about. What would be the one top of the list thing that you'd like to leave people with?
It's such a great question, Mary. I think I end with, and I kind of say it in the book, but it's to take back control, to de-externalize. A lot of what the pandemic did for people was they were told, right? We were told, stay inside. You must do this. You must do that. Medical autonomy, notwithstanding. Like all these kind of ideas that basically your world was no longer controlled by you and your choices were no longer. A lot of people feeling that in a very real way. And so it's the call to action, I guess. The one thing would be to reclaim your sense of agency and control and autonomy, including over your internal world. The cavalry is not coming. You are responsible for you. That has been made very clear to many people, but I think the giving you permission to take the reins again, I think that would be kind of the undertone of the whole of the work. And the reason why some of my, research shifted in this direction was that I realized, to your point, when I talked to people, clients and, students in my classrooms, that they were feeling very much like they'd lost some of that agency, that autonomy, that control, that choice. And that's a very harmful place for high performers, for any performer, for anybody, is to feel like you don't have control over something, or you don't know when and how you can enact, your own reality again. And so it's that. I think it's the call to action of saying, don't let people tell you what to do, or the boss tell you what to do, or the company tell you what to do, but understand where in the science you might find logic and rationale for that, and make your choices your way. And then implicit in all of that, of course, and I said it before kind of a couple of different times, different ways, but is self-reflection, is the idea that you're self-aware, like you understand what you need and why, what your limits are, your barriers, because all of this informs that too. Is when you start to take action, you then have to implicitly understand, well, what are my boundaries? What are my triggers? What are the things that I need? What are the things I can dispense of? And so you get really clear on that. And so there's a knowledge of self that goes into being more autonomous and agendic and choiceful.
Great way to end off this fabulous conversation, Brynn. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Brynn Winegard. She is an applied neuroscientist and author of her new book, The Working Brain, Optimize Your Workday Performance. Now, if you'd like to know more about Brynn and her work, please check out our show notes. And while you're there, if you liked what you heard, please donate to CRAM. We are a charity and we rely on donations to run our podcast. That's it for today. And to stay up to date on CRAM, please follow us on social. Our handle is @CRAM Ideas. Thanks for listening and see you back here next time.